This week saw Trade Union Federation COSATU take to the streets over job losses against the unbundling of Eskom. The already fragile economy was also hit by 5 days of load shedding. Yesterday, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a special cabinet committee on Eskom headed by Deputy President David Mabuza. But will this be enough to restore investor confidence? For more on this, I'm joined by Professor Raymond Parsons, an economist from the Northwest University's Business School. Good evening, Prof. Thanks.
Good evening, boy.
Very much for coming through. Always a pleasure, as always. Let's start with COSATU. I mean, the job of unions is to, fight for, try to secure shop floor victories for their workers. And for federations like COSATU, it becomes even more important because the more members they have, the more muscle they have. So they were within their rights, weren't they, to take to the streets?
Well, that's all part of our democratic process and the right to protest, the right to strike. And if we go back to the overarching comments which our president made when he heard about the Eskom problem, that he was shocked and angry. I think that's probably shared by almost all the stakeholders and all the viewers here this evening, that was certainly something which has elicited a universal reaction and where people are looking for solutions and for looking in particular how we can keep the lights on, because clearly that's a fundamental issue for the South African economy. You may recall a phrase that a week is a long time in politics. Well, I can say I think South Africa's found the past week has been a long week for the economy. And what's important now is that we identify the solutions to turn the situation around, because this is bad for confidence, bad for stakeholders, and you can't blame stakeholders if they react angrily and strongly to what they see is a very negative development.
And given South African workers' experience of privatization, do you think COSATU's fears are unrealistic?
I think what we've got to do is we've got to stand back. I'm not an ideologist, I'm a pragmatist. I'm saying we've got some serious problems here that have been looming up for some time. They didn't fall like a sort of manna from heaven in the last week. There's been a long lead time, and we've had warning signals that there need to be not only short-term solutions, for example, we're talking about the Eskom problem, but also the longer-term restructuring. Now, we must be prepared to look at what this implies. And I think all that has been done at this stage is to say, in principle, yes, we are going to divide Eskom up into 3 units. I think that's a point of departure. Let's use it as a platform for debate as to what wider options lie within that framework. Let's not ban any word or idea. Let's say we're prepared to engage. That's important. Business, labor, and the government must engage on identifying what solutions would work under a new dispensation for a key organization like Eskom.
But, Prof, the way the President presented this in his State of the Nation address was that dividing Eskom up is what is going to happen. The next step is the house and so on.
Yeah.
But here is where this thing becomes problematic for certain stakeholders like labor, for example. Is that how do you arrive at that point without first knowing what exactly is wrong with the entity? Because the suggestion now that there's going to be experts from outside the country brought in, and there's a committee, cabinet committee chaired by the deputy president that's going to update the president daily and so on. It then suggests that all along, this thing was allowed to just happen. No one really interrogated the facts. No one knew, by the government's own admission, what exactly was going on. Only now are we going to try and discover what it is exactly that's been going on.
That's fair comment. But the point here is we must distinguish between who is accountable. And, you know, there's going to be a parliamentary debate next week. The Zondo Commission is going to debate a few days to the whole issue of corruption and state capture in Eskom. So what went wrong in the past and who is accountable, I think that has to be done. But in the meantime, what do we do in the short term? And I think bringing in the experts and that sort of thing, that's to do with the short term. That is, how do we improve the maintenance? How do we ensure that we don't get an unexpected breakdown and so forth? Those are key issues to build confidence that at least in the short term, with winter coming, we will keep the lights on. That's the one level. The other level is the longer-term structural issue. And I am saying the President has opened the door to saying we can have a debate around how we implement the idea that we need a more flexible, a more competitive Eskom structure. How do we get there? Well, there's going to be a process. And that process will engage the stakeholders. And I think before we jump to conclusions, we should say we are prepared to be open-minded and see how can we restructure an entity which is no longer serving the country well in its present format. I don't see why anyone should want to resist the opening up of new options on the structure. As long as everyone is engaged, that there's leadership, there's credibility, and that obviously it's going to be a longer term issue. You won't be able to restructure Eskom next week or the week after, but you've got to send out a message to the economy and to investors that there is a sense of direction about the long term, whatever the band-aid in the short term, and we'll see more of it in the budget next week. There'll be band-aid to see us through the short term, to keep the lights on, but coupled to that must be a message that there's going to be restructuring, that we engage stakeholders and build enough consensus to ensure that Eskom will serve the nation better in future than it is doing at the moment. It has caused an enormous amount of damage. I don't have to spell it out. The government recognizes, opposition, business, labor. I think we must now get past the stage of just wringing our hands and rather putting our hands to what are some of the possible solutions, and that will require us to put the national interest first as to how to get Eskom right.
Prof, I'm inviting you now. Next week, you come back here after the budget speech, and I'd like you to tell us whether you think what Tito Mboweni will have said does indeed do the thing.
That's very important. It's his maiden budget, and he's got a tough call to make.
Okay. Professor Raymond Parsons, an economist from the Northwest University.